Daniel's trying to get his setup working, and then we'll probably... Oh, we are live.
Test, test.
We can hear you, Daniel. Oh. Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we were able to hear you, but guess you couldn't hear us. Anyway, did anyone have anything pressing? I just had one kind of thing that I already mentioned in the chat, but now that we're live, I'll really go into it more, but I don't want to cut in front of anybody.
I have a couple of questions about that documentary hypothesis stuff if we get around to it.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm just digging into Jay and writing this book of Bible stories. So the first one, of course, has to be the Garden of Eden, and Jay writing it, and trying to get the context of who Jay would have been and where he would have been, and probably a he. There's this idea it might have been a she, but that seems unlikely to me. So anyhow, just anybody had any thoughts on that?
I actually haven't read much about where they think he was probably writing from. Reuven probably knows more about that. I also doubt it was a woman. But I think Wellhausen said it was the earliest source. Is that what he said, or that the Elohist was? I forget.
The J.
It was J. Okay.
So you're scratching my limited knowledge on it. It's, I think it's from like 10,000 BCE or 9,000, or maybe in the middle. Maybe Old Testament is not really my area, not of expertise, I'm afraid.
Narrowed down actually to the early 700s, or I guess late 700s BC.
Yeah, geez. 10,000.
Just an order of magnitude.
Oh,
he was a caveman.
This is what I mean. It's not my area of expertise.
Well, hey, it's sort of, one order of magnitude and a couple digits. It's all right.
Yeah. So I might just click over to that fount of knowledge of Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wellhausen put it sometime around the monarchical period of Israel, but he didn't want to try and date it more specifically, just because it's hard to date. And then Gunkel had said that a lot of scholars will argue that I'm going to get them mixed up, but Jay was from the northern or southern kingdom, and one of the other sources, I think the Elohist, was from one of the two also. So each of them was supposedly from one. But he was saying that
he's from the southern, the E source is from the northern, I think.
Right, yeah, is that right? Jay southern?
Pretty sure.
Well, anyway, Gunkel was saying that even though there seemed to be some things that Jay mentions that, like he references more often things in Judea, but he was saying, it's really not that clear cut in either case that they could be really narrowed down to coming out of one particular region or the other. So it's just not clear. Now, I don't know if Wellhausen agrees with that or not. He may actually place it in the south for sure.
Well, it's speculative fiction. I mean, I want to really just have a fairly short introduction part to the story about Jay sitting there, in Jerusalem, starting to write down Eden story, and then cut to Eve waking up, and then kind of following what this is mostly Bob's contribution to evolving out of Eden. This part was what the tree of knowledge being about sex and about, hey, guess what, they know how to reproduce now, and we need to get them out of there so they don't get the tree of immortality too. So, but I wanted to give some context to that.
So I can recommend a book for you, Ed, that sort of does what you're talking about. The Living World of the Old Testament by B. Anderson. Really good chapters about the full document hypothesis, and actually it was a book that was really helpful in my undergraduate studies of the Old Testament. And it had a few pages that did sort of what you were talking about, where it tried to demonstrate, illustrate, that this would have been a priestly writer, perhaps in the court of a king. So yeah, it might be useful to you.
Cool.
But yeah, the Living World of the Old Testament.
I'm looking it up right now here. Of course, it's one of these ridiculously expensive paper-only books.
I'm sorry, my friend.
They sell like 3 of these a year,
You can get older editions of it for fairly cheap, where it's pretty much the same. I actually have two. I had 2 editions, and they were virtually identical with very, very minute changes. So if you got an older edition, it's still going to help you.
Okay.
Yeah,
thanks. It looks interesting.
I like the sexual knowledge thing too, because one of the big things, like he says, is now they're going to populate the garden, and if they eat from the tree of life, they'll live forever, and they'll just be humans everywhere.
Right. And I'm trying to look up this stuff about Nehushtan or Leviathan. I don't know how you pronounce any of this stuff, but that connection with the serpent and the snake, the serpent that Moses held up, and what Bob says, well, that might have been a disgruntled snake worshiper who was forced into being Yahwist at this point, and still kind of wants to get a few licks in about Yahweh being the one who lied, and the serpent really was the one telling the truth. I'm kind of looking for. That seems like kind of a not mainstream theory, and I'm looking to see where he might have gotten that from. So I'll give him a call tomorrow, but he hates talking on the phone. But
yeah, I think I may be wrong, but I think Margaret Barker goes into some of that stuff too, because I think he mentions her a lot in connection with that older mythology stuff with Nehushtan and all that stuff.
Couple good leads here.
Yeah. I'm not sure if it comes mainly from her book, The Great Angel, or the Older Testament. It may be in both. I'm not sure, but I think pretty sure she writes about that.
Okay. All right.
I just want to make the quick comment that, like, 10 minutes ago we were worried that we would not have enough people, and then wazam!
Yeah, now it's full, right? Not one spot left.
Cool.
Yeah, I'd be really curious if Jay was kind of like a disgruntled Nehushtan worshiper. I don't know if that has anyone put that forward. That particular theory as you laid it out.
Let me look through my much thumbed copy of the book here. It's been a while since I went through this thing, over a year and a half now, so it's kind of embarrassing, my own co-authored book, and I can't point to that part of it, but this was definitely Bob's part of it. The other thing is it's interesting how like I'm going to put another part of the story where the actual pre-hominid, well, actually hominids, 100,000 years ago or so, in the general area, they were fairly early in the Mideast. It was the first stop, really, after crossing the Delta, or the Red Sea, areas of the Red Sea where they could maybe get across from Africa. And so the Levant was really first way station in the migration out. So I thought it would be kind of neat to have transition from the Eden story to an actual woman there who's giving birth in pain in childbirth, and life sucks. I mean, there's no meds, there's no one kid after the other until you die early, possibly of childbirth, and you're wearing animal skins, and it's just like the Eden story says, and it's definitely not the Eden story, but it is welcome to harsh reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think it wouldn't be too hard to imagine that whoever the J writer was envisioned what he thought would have been, a very primordial state, even for as long ago as he was writing.
Right, yeah, it's possible, sure.
But
Yeah, the animal skins, the animal skins thing is intriguing. I've always thought that was kind of intriguing.
You mean the fact that they're wearing clothes, or that they're animal skins?
That they are animal skins. That was their first clothing, and the J writer knew that. I mean, he they weren't wearing animal skins when he was around. They had fabrics and textiles and stuff, but it was just interesting that he figured. I mean, he got it wrong about sewing fig leaves without needles. That was kind of lame, but the other part was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I had. I didn't want to take up the whole thing. That's just.
Regarding the fig leaves and the animal skins, I had something I noticed in a previous Hangout about that.
Okay.
The making of clothes out of fig leaves after they eat the fruit is a way to demonstrate how they gained knowledge from eating the fruit. They actually gained a trade skill at that point in time, and were able to actually do the making of clothing. But God, who's afraid that they're going to become like Him, they only partially became like Him, and He still has better skills than they do. So He makes better clothes for them out of skins.
Interesting. That is interesting. Is that your idea there, Wayne, or is that something you've seen somewhere? What's that? I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Wayne.
Yeah, it's my idea. Yeah.
I wanna actually get your name so I can put a footnote to that if I put it in.
Okay, give me a moment here. Give me a moment here. They're on screen.
Yeah, I see it. Okay.
I'm afraid I missed the end of it because I got up to grab a book.
Let me repeat the thought to make sure I got it right here, Wayne. Is that the fig leaves were their first attempt at demonstrating. They kind of had some knowledge, and so sewing fig leaves was kind of the first trade craft. But then God came along and made better clothes for them, so He kind of one-upped them, demonstrating His superior knowledge. Is that about right?
Yeah, but the fact is the making of the fig leaves right after is tied to them eating the fruit. I mean, it's a result of them eating the fruit, and it occurs immediately next in the story.
Right.
Partially because they now have the ability to do that. And the knowledge of the need for it, too, but those are all combined in this, they're conflated in the story.
Okay.
There's an interesting idea, too, that the entire creation account up to Abraham is trying to kind of show the different steps to becoming fully civilized, essentially, or coming into civilization. Like Wayne was saying, at first they're sowing fig leaves, so they have that skill, and then they start tilling the earth, and then as you keep going, there are more and more things that keep getting introduced that are showing like an advancement of the level of civilization, essentially. up to Abraham, and then pretty much they're at the point where the J author probably was as far as being civilized.
One
I'm
of the things
sorry.
that's interesting
Yeah.
with the as the advancement of like the normacy of civilization sorts of takes off. What's interesting with that is that it's juxtaposed with the breakdown of a lot of social dynamics. That like the first relationship, marriage, breaks down in a sense. Family dynamics break down, and there's all this. And unfortunately, a lot of more Christian apologists have overly read sin into this equation. It's like, oh, we watch relationships break down until Christ redeems them. But one of the things that Walter Brueggemann talks about is um, when we get to the prophets, it's very interesting that we talk about what is the relationship between self and Yahweh, between self and tribe, between the tribe and Yahweh, between the nation. So one of the things Brueggemann talks about all the time is we can sort of see these ticking time bombs of issues start to be explored in the four sources, particularly with the breakdown of these relationships.
Like where Eve says, "Hey," or Adam says, "Hey, she gave me the fruit." Is that what the start of that?
Yeah, that's what Brueggemann talks about. That the first basic scene we have is a breakdown. It's a breakdown of relationship, and Brueggemann thinks that's significant. Particularly, Brueggemann thinks that's significant, or at least will become significant to the Hebrew understanding about exile and return. He sees that primarily as a very informative sort of narrative in Hebrew thinking that when you really boil down most of the Old Testament, it's all about exile and return, exile and return.
Does anyone happen to remember the exact verse where it talks about them making the fig leaf clothing, covering themselves with fig leaves off the top of their head?
Well, it's chapter 3.
Yeah.
Chapter 3, verse 7.
7, okay, thanks. I went right past it.
Man, you guys love the Old Testament on this Hangout.
Well, it's just this thing has sort of monopolized the conversation. Feel free to other people.
Oh no,
feel
no,
free.
no! It just happened. It's just it comes up so much. I just find it very interesting. It just makes me feel very exposed that I really should get back to the Hebrew Bible sometime and spend some time with my old pals Moses and Abraham.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
in writing a book of Bible stories, really the good stuff is in the Old Testament. I've been trying to think of some New Testament stuff to talk about in a clear-headed way, not a pious way with some twists there. And it's just there's not too much in the New Testament to encapsulate into a story without getting harmonizing contradicting accounts and all kinds of things that make things complicated.
What you got there, Wayne?
Well, I just wanted to say that I like twists, though.
There you go.
Visual representation. There we go.
Just in case anyone doesn't have it, this link in the chat is to the entire Pentateuch with all the sources colored, which is really useful. I know we
Hmm.
mentioned it a few times, but in case anyone doesn't have anything like that, there's a link to the King James with all the sources colored. New King James.
Cool. Very, very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Jeez.
Oh, you asked me what I had. It's a blank sheet of graph paper.
Oh, there we go.
Does anybody have any I'll throw something else. Anybody have any suggestions for stories from the Bible they'd like to see? That are not in your typical Sunday school class. That are not total downers either. I don't want it to just be blood and guts. Massacring Midianites. I'll throw some of that stuff in there, but just stuff that hey, that's in the Bible. Wow.
Okay, my favorite Bible story back when I was a Christian, and it still is one of mine now, is I love the dialogue between the prophet Jeremiah and God, where Jeremiah just has at God. It was like, "You have duped me, Lord, and I've allowed myself to be duped." It's this really impassionate, and I curse the day you called me to be your prophet. It's I don't know. I think it's a really interesting story about, because we have these ideas like, oh, you can't talk to God like that, and here's this Jeremiah fellow just like, shaking his fist at God. I love it.
Huh.
So who
Interesting.
would you have play Jeremiah in the reenactment?
Oh, geez, that's. I don't. If we're going for comedic purposes, I don't know, or you know.
Are you looking for stories off the beaten path, like not the stuff everyone knows?
Yeah. Exactly. Like, let's see. One of them is Concubine Carnage. I think you guys probably know what that one's about. And then the um, Have Another Drink, Daddy. That's going to be in there. Lot's Daughter.
That's fairly well known.
I
Yeah,
take
that's
it you're
very.
working on a new book.
You'd be surprised though, as far as people that should know the Bible. That's just avert your eyes.
Have
You
another
won't
drink.
hear him in Sunday school.
No.
One thing I've always, it's not, I mean, it's just not really a story, but a short little weird thing in Exodus where God has just sent Moses to Egypt, and all of a sudden, on the way there, he tries to kill Moses. And that's where Zipporah, circumcises the son and throws the foreskin at someone's feet. But I've heard a ton of different. I mean, obviously, it has something to do with establishing circumcision as a tradition by that author. But I've heard other arguments that it's meant to. I think Dr. Price has talked about it too. It's meant to be an official ending of child sacrifice, and that just the act of circumcision is like a redeeming act rather than actually sacrificing children.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's just like one. It's just a few little passages just kind of crammed in there out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
But that one's always weird that not many people talk about.
My next door neighbor who we go walking with for just some exercise, I pointed that story out to her and she did not believe me, so I just pulled out my phone and showed it, and she was just like, what the heck? Like, yeah, she did not know that was in the Bible. The more you know.
Yeah. There's a lot of those.
What does she not know is in the Bible?
I think like a person can go to church for like 10 years and not learn more than 10% of the Bible in that time.
Absolutely. I've thought of it would be fun to go back through I'm not going to do it, but go back through my old church's sermons and do a sample of what passages they reference, and then change the font size of the text to match how much they reference it, I mean, most of it would be microscopic. You wouldn't be able to even be able to see it. But then you'd have a few, the Lord is my shepherd. Boom, big bold font, and then everything else is barely visible. And
You know what? Like something. This is a sort of tangential thing, but reflecting upon the sermons I gave back when I was a seminarian, I actually kind of don't regret the message like I gave in most of them, and I think that most preachers would. Um, yes, I think most preachers who have sort of come the way we have now, I think most of them wouldn't. Like I know Dr. Price talks about this quite a bit, where he actually, even though he doesn't believe the essence of most of the stories he's preached on back in his Christian days, the essence of what he was talking about, love and commitment, community, forgiveness, charity, they're still good things. So, yeah, just a little side thought. Let's not be too hard on people.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Are you working on a new book, Ed?
Yeah, this is that. I mentioned it on the Bible Geek listeners. Tim Boz suggested the title, The Bold Testament, and then just the subtitle. I forget what subtitle I was going to pick, but it's basically, stories with a twist in the Bible, and one of them is already online. It's Jehu's Jihad. That's on my blog. So I got another 10 or so in addition to that. I'm going to put in there.
Oh, it sounds interesting. And you're just giving commentaries on them, on each of the stories?
Not too much. Footnotes. It's going to be fiction with footnotes, in which people can read the footnotes or not if they want. But it's just, I mostly just want to be authentic. I don't want to be making stuff totally like some of these pious Christian fiction. They, oh gee, we'll just make this up and make it fit with the message. No, whatever, what it says, like that. King Jehu's actions were just horrible, and so I've got a first-person account there that talks about this vicious psychopath and the way he acted, and he's not a nice person, and the narrative reflects that.
Oh, so you're doing like artistic retellings of some of these stories?
Yeah.
Okay.
With footnotes to make it authentic. Hey, here's the passage where I'm referring to now. Which. And
that sounds interesting.
Hope so. I was really a kick when that first story, Jehu's Jihad, Seth Andrews on The Thinking Atheist, he read from that to cap off his show about a month ago and wound up getting I think it's gotten about 1,000 views now, mostly as a result of that, so that was kind of fun.
Oh, that's cool. Getting some pre-publishing press already.
Yeah.
Well, my question would take us into the New Testament. I don't want to change topics necessarily if you guys don't want to.
I'm fine with that.
Yay!
I'm wondering if, well, I guess if you're taking the standard datings, if Luke is quoting Paul, or I guess possibly, but probably not, Luke is, did I say, yeah, Paul's quoting Luke or Luke's quoting Paul, but the passages I'm mentioning are in 1 Timothy, which I know Paul didn't write. It uses the phrase, the worker deserves his wages, which is also from Luke. Luke chapter 10, verse 7. For the worker deserves his wages. And then again in 1 Corinthians, he uses the phrase in regards to the Last Supper, do this in remembrance of me. That's in 1 Corinthians 11:24, and then same thing in Luke, obviously. Do this in remembrance of me. So what's the connection there? I mean, was Luke using Paul, and was 1 Timothy using Paul, or what's the deal there? Or were these phrases just common creed things within Christianity? What do you guys think? The remembrance of me thing seems like it could just be a creedal format type thing. So it would have just been floating around. They both would have known it.
I think in the remembrance of me thing is definitely the formation of a creedal ritual association with what will become the Lord's Supper. It seems to, when you look at the Synoptics, when you look at Corinthians, when you look at the Didache and the early church fathers, that phrase, or at least some version of that phrase, is well in the lexicon at that stage. So I think that's definitely the question of does Luke know the Pauline letters is a question that scholarship has wrestled over. It's one of those things where it's like Luke definitely knows Paul in the sense he knows the legend of Paul, what Paul was about in some sense or another, but does Luke have access to the Pauline corpus? That's an issue. That's a much stickier issue.
Yeah, the first, and those are the two where, well, the thing between 1 Corinthians and Luke, like you said, yeah, I think you could probably say that they didn't necessarily weren't using each other, but that seems creedal, like you said. But the 1 Timothy thing, was 1 Timothy using Luke, I guess, because that one seems a little more, it doesn't seem to be part of a creed or any kind of, standardized thing like that. The worker deserves his wages.
Well, that goes back to the ox treading out the corn from the Old Testament, isn't? He mentions that as part of that. He makes an analogy to that.
Okay, you're right. Yeah, so that comes from the Old Testament. Okay, that explains it then.
Don't muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain. The worker deserves his wages.
And what book is that from?
I'm not sure.
That's from Exodus, right? Or, I'm sorry, Genesis, isn't it?
No, I don't think it's Genesis. It's Deuteronomy for some reason.
Leviticus.
Yeah, probably.
Leviticus 19:13. Do not hold back the wages of a hired hand. That's one translation of it. That's just one of the cross references Bible Gateway is giving me.
What's the verse number?
Leviticus 19:13 is one cross reference Bible Gateway is given me, and another one is Deuteronomy 24:14. I'm going to check. Yeah, these are just cross references Bible Gateway is giving me.
Yeah, Deuteronomy 25:4. Thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn.
Well, the particular thing I'm keying in on there is the exact same phraseology between Luke and 1 Timothy, which is, for the worker deserves his wages.
I think that's probably, seeing as this is found in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's probably more evidence that Timothy and Luke both know the passage from the Old Testament rather than knowing each other, or one knowing the other.
What's interesting, too, is just looking at the thing from... Well, yeah, Deuteronomy just has, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. But Leviticus, it was 19:13, has, yeah, do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. So I don't think there's a connection between those two, are there? I mean, the thing from Leviticus isn't
it's
right up against the muzzle your ox thing.
it's a bit strained.
And the phrasing between 1 Timothy and Luke is almost identical, whereas the thing in Leviticus is a prohibition rather than, you know, what would you say, a command or recommendation. Because in Leviticus it say, do not hold back the wages overnight. Not, make sure you pay them that day. Don't pay them the next day. But in Luke and 1 Timothy, like, it uses the same phrase. The worker deserves his wages.
Let me check the Greek.
Yeah, what Che said, if I'm saying that right, possibly the redactor of Luke was also the author of Timothy, possibly.
I wouldn't agree with that. Seems to be a little bit of discontinuity between some of their theological ideas, I think. But where in Timothy is this?
It's in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 18.
Chapter 5, verse 18. I'll just be lazy. 5:18. First Timothy 5:18. And where is it in Luke?
In Luke, it's in chapter 10, verse 7.
So let's see if the Greeks how comparable the Greek is.
Now, they use the same phraseology, but they're doing it in different connections. Like in 1 Timothy, it's in relation to... Because 1 Timothy is saying, for Scripture says, do not muzzle an ox, blah, 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 blah. And here's another quote from Scripture, the worker deserves his wages. So I'm wondering if he's actually referencing Luke as Scripture. Because the worker deserves his wages, I'm not aware of that being in the Old Testament, at least phrased that way. But it is in Luke, phrased that same exact way. And if 1 Timothy is saying that Luke is Scripture, that would have some bearing on the dating, for sure. Or seems like it would.
Well, we would also have to cover whether or not that particular reference in Timothy is also an interpolation. Let's not forget that part, because Timothy, the document of Timothy has gone through so many retranslations and reeditions and adages and takeaways from the actual text that it's hard to tell whether or not what is original to the text versus what isn't. That's kind of the thing that really makes that makes Timothy any kind, matter of fact, any Timothy at all, hard to determine in terms of dating. At least from what I remember, that could have changed in the past 4 years.
Yeah, it could be an interpolation for sure. I'm not against that idea at all.
Well, I would disagree purely based off my footnotes that in my Novum Testament Graece, the passage seems to be in a lot of manuscripts, and Clement seems to reference it. So if it's an interpolation, it's a damn early one by the looks of things.
Who mentioned it, you said?
Clement.
Oh, okay.
So Clement seems to know of this passage in Timothy.
Sorry, I need to ask for clarification. I always get the Clements confused. Are we talking about Clement as in Clement Bishop, or Clement the Pope, or First Clement? I mean, sorry,
Clement of Rome is usually who this one is referencing. But I will check the little. When I see that, I'll just double check that for everybody. I'm pretty sure it's Clement of Rome.
Yeah, because if it's Clement of Rome, it's a lot earlier than Clement of Alexandria.
Yeah. Oh boy, this is so hard. The footnotes in this thing are like, I don't know if you guys can see that, but the footnotes are just like tiny, of like, and it's like 2 letters.
And is it printed on tissue paper?
Oh yeah, and it's got like, it's got P1 to a million, and all the different other like references and other. Yeah, the appendix in this is just nuts in terms of what manuscripts have what, who references what. So.
It was always good to have, but they were always hard to read.
Yeah. Well, just for reading off the cuff, GreekBible.com is a really good resource for just reading off the cuff. But if you want to get into the textual criticism, admittedly, something I do not do very often, not for these sort of purposes, it's a whole different kettle of fish. No, Clement of Rome. Yeah, it's Rome. So, apparently, he references it in one of his theological book things. Let me see if I can find that.
Yeah, it's always good to actually go through some of the primary sources on some of these things because I found quite quickly, I might add, that some of these scholars, whenever they're referencing books, they're not actually referencing their primary sources in them themselves for some reason. What they're doing is that they're referencing other scholars that reference the primary sources, and therefore they reference their reference, and everything gets lost in the translation. Kind of like, for example, the original article that spawned the whole early date for P52, when in fact you find out that the original article itself doesn't even argue for an early date. It just says that his colleagues believe it's the case, and somehow that got interpreted as him believing it's the case, and somehow that got reinterpreted as him, you know how it goes. But yeah, it's really sort of a, I don't want to say clusterfuck, but I might as well just say it.
The real interesting thing to me is that he's saying Scripture says, and the one comes from the Old Testament, and the other is coming from Luke.
Does make you wonder if he's talking about is he talking about a passage from the Old Testament that he has mistranslated or perhaps done his own interpretation on, or is he quoting from Luke and therefore the Gospel of Luke or whatever it was at that stage, is that now scriptural? And if it is scripture, what does that even mean for him? Like,
More than likely, it's probably the Old Testament, considering, and if I recall this correctly, I'm not too sure if I am, but if I recall it correctly, Clement of Rome almost exclusively tends to refer to Scripture as in the Old Testament. But when he refers to sayings which are sacred for the Christians, he's referring to the sayings of the disciples.
That's
yeah,
what I'm getting at. Like, why would 1 Timothy have considered something from Luke's Scripture when that early, even like Clement of Rome, weren't saying? Was he saying that that stuff was Scripture already?
Yeah, most of the early 2nd century, Scripture means the Old Testament, means the Hebrew Bible. And when they talk about the Gospels, it's usually, like Justin Martyr calls them the memoirs of the apostles, Clement calls it like the words of the apostles, things like that. They're very vague, or the teachings of the apostles, things like that. And we don't even know exactly what they mean by that, like which Gospels they're referring to. And some of them we can piece together pretty easily, others are a bit more confusing. But yeah, and when it comes to actual what you're talking about, Doug, it's the Old Testament, not the New. So maybe Timothy's even later than some people might think. But then
That's what
um,
I'm wondering.
mm, that's yeah. If Dennis MacDonald is correct, Timothy should be dated towards much later than we'd normally submitted, which is towards the middle of the 2nd century as a means to combat the acts of Paul and Thecla in which women have a lot of power and authority. And if a version of Luke is earlier than that, maybe it could be scriptural. I doubt it, but if Timothy is from the middle of the 2nd century, um, who knows what that might mean.
Yeah, I mean, I'd want to know too, and I'm too ignorant of the early church fathers' writings, but where do we find our earliest instances of them referring to New Testament writings as scripture? How early does that start happening? Do we know?
I believe personally, and this is from my own personal studies, I believe it's the earliest one would be Irenaeus.
Yeah.
Although there are cases that have been made for others earlier than him, but I think that's the earliest you could definitely say this is scripture. This is what he's referring to. It's New Testament, as opposed to this is scripture. He's referring to New Testament here. This is scripture. He's referring to Old Testament there.
Yeah,
who is that?
Irenaeus.
Oh, okay.
Irenaeus, as you Americans say it. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Is it Devon?
It's Devon.
Okay, yeah, most of the early church fathers prior to Irenaeus, they either don't say it or they're hinting around it. So what we're getting is that word I like, emergence. The idea of the New Testament is emerging, and they sort of don't spell it out in this mathematical way of like what is Scripture, this is that. But Irenaeus seems to be the first person to do it. And the thing that most scholars find fascinating is Irenaeus is doing it reactionary. That Irenaeus is saying the things he's saying not because he wants to make a statement about Scripture and about the New Testament, but rather against those who say the alternative, like Marcion and Valentinus. And so it's an interesting thing to think about that most people don't, particularly some people think about with the Bible is the New Testament is the result of reaction to other people saying what is Scripture and what is not.
So you're saying Irenaeus was only calling it... Sorry, go ahead.
It's quite right. I was just going to say, given the reputation that Irenaeus had for being a heresy hunter, it's not surprising that his use of the term Scripture in reference towards Christianity would be reactionary. I mean, that's all heresy hunters did at that point in time. They were basically the modern day equivalent of you're not a real Christian because you don't believe X, Y, and Z. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. It just like one of the things that people talk about a lot in terms of the pop culture zeitgeist that was the Da Vinci Code is they think about the Bible as the product of a council. That seems to be the idea most people have when they think about the Bible. They think, oh, people got together in this democratic way, and we had winners and we had losers, and it all came down to a vote. And what I try to point them out is that no, actually, it wasn't like that. It was a battle. Like I quite like the term Mark Ehrman uses in his subtitle, the battles for Scripture we didn't even know about. We have this backwards and forwards, and this what is, what isn't between people, and it's not so much like, for example, the Gospel of Judas. It's not like the Gospel of Judas ever stood a real chance of getting into the New Testament. That's a misunderstanding. But the fact you had communities saying this is the text where we find God, where we find authority, where we find influence, and those texts are not. And we have this debate, that's much more complex than, say, a simple vote, like some people misconstrued.
I did want to say one thing real quick about the Council of Nicaea. I'll say that they kind of did influence the books for which Jesus would actually be put forth. Like, if I remember correctly, I think the Book of Revelations was something that was actually debated as to whether or not it could be considered scriptural authority, or whether or not people could derive scriptural authority. So the little books here and there that were debated for the Council of Nicaea was primarily determined as to who Jesus was. And determining who Jesus was for Christianity ultimately did determine what books would actually be put into the canon. But that's my outlook, in other words. In other words, I say, you're kind of right, but you're kind of wrong at the same time. But anyways, I got to do the issues here. I'll be right back. I'm still listening, by the way.
So who was the guy you were talking about who dated 1 Timothy to, what did you say, mid-second century?
Dennis MacDonald,
Okay.
who everybody knows in these circles.
Ronald McDonald?
Yeah, well, everybody knows him as the author of Homer and the Gospel of Mark, which is a very good book, don't get me wrong, but in my own studies of Paul and Thecla, his book, The Legend and the Apostle, which is all about Thecla and Timothy, is very, very interesting. That because Thecla is this figure of female apostolic influence and power. She baptizes herself. Paul himself commissions her to go preach the good news. She's actually called an apostle. And then you've got Timothy saying, women, shut up. You know, MacDonald sees this as an unfolding second century issue about the role of women in church. So, very, very good book. I would highly recommend it. Yes, I agree. He does make a great case.
What do you think of his Homer claims in Mark?
You know what? I think there's a precedence there, and I think he may be onto something. Some of his stuff, I think, is a little strange, but the conception of it is really good. It's one of those things where it's like, how do we teach kids to write these days? Well, a lot of the stuff we use what's popular. You know, English teachers I know, you know, they're reading Harry Potter because kids know it and they can relate to it and they can think about it and they know that sort of style and stuff. What was the most common, like, story in the ancient world? Like, how would someone in the ancient world be taught to read and write? Like, what was their textbook? Yeah, the Odyssey, you know, it's what Alexander the Great, according to legend, you know, moved around with him wherever he went. It's the source of Hellenistic literature, apparently. It kind of makes sense that there's going to be influences and similarities. So that, his fundamental idea, I think, definitely is worth exploring. Some of the stuff I think is a little sketchy, but that idea I think is great.
You guys are talking about Dennis R. MacDonald and his thesis on Mark and Mark and Homer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. I wasn't too sure. Yeah, I never actually read the books themselves, so I can't really say too much. I'm talking about MacDonald's books, if you guys are wondering. But, you know, I didn't see, like, I have an old book of Homer that I haven't pulled off the shelves in years, all the way back since high school that I read. And I can't really recall any kind of similarities that he's talking about. Could you guys run down this thesis for me, if you guys don't mind? Or if not, that's perfectly fine, too, as well. I'm just curious.
His thesis on the Mark-Homer connection?
Yeah, like, as in, what is it based off of? Is it based off of similarities in narrative structure? Is it based off of certain word usage and textualization? Was it based on certain things like this column here of text actually coincides with this column here of text? If you take it out of context and analyze it throughout the textual variations, and what was the basis for his thesis? Is what I'm asking.
I can answer that a little bit. I didn't finish reading the book, but I read the beginnings of it. And he actually at the beginning of his book lists out what his criteria are. But basically what it boils down to is having a lot of the same story elements in the same order, using some of the same vocabulary.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense. Then it lends legitimacy to the idea that it is, because that is a genuine textual method to determine influence from one source to the other.
Yeah, pretty much the thing that MacDonald himself points out, in the sense that many, how am I going to use this? Some more vocal and aggressive atheist scholars, I guess, or maybe like just atheist critics, I guess you would say. What he's saying is he's not saying that the Gospels are just created out of whole cloth, so to speak, with Homer as their backbone. The point he's saying is that they have a lot in common in their structure, in their wording, in some of their elements. That clearly something is going on here. He would argue there's definitely Jesus material and Jesus tradition and early Christian theology and worship and devotion. But in all this, there is some Homeric elements that we need to study. So that's one of the things when I find people talking about this text that I think they're trying to make MacDonald say something that is not. I don't know if you found that, guys, but that's just something in an interview with MacDonald he himself has stressed.
Well, he does point out the similarities between specific stories, like the thing with the Gadarene demoniac and Circe and the pigs and all that. So I think unless I'm thinking of a different author, I think it's the same guy. He does seem to say that certain stories were framed. Certain stories in the Gospel of Mark were basically framed off of a story from Homer.
Yeah, and he's definitely saying that, but I think he is getting concerned how some people are taking that and running wild with it.
The whole Jesus story is just a retelling of Homer.
Exactly, which he's not saying.
The Iliad.
Yeah, it's not the Jewish. Like he's basically saying, guys, it's not the Jewish Iliad. Another one.
How much, this is a little bit off, but somebody, it just made me think of it. How much this Egyptian influence, I know the Horus story has been sort of discredited, the whole zeitgeist thing, but I mean, there must have been some Egyptian influence. They weren't far away, and they had one time been the occupiers of what became Israel and Judah. What kind of Egyptian influence do you think there is, if any?
Very little, in my opinion. But,
yeah.
Well, the book I picked up on Daniel's recommendation, Old Testament Parallels.
I was that we talk about the Old Testament or the New Testament now?
Well, either one, I guess.
In the Old Testament, there's lots of parallels, but in the New Testament, by the time you get to the Maccabees, no.
Yeah, the early stuff. Yeah.
What was that wonderful book I recommended to you, Doug?
Old Testament Parallels by Victor Matthews and Don Benjamin.
And you're enjoying it?
I've just been reading a few of the stories here and there because the whole thing's broken up into different myths or stories from various well, Sumerian, Egyptian, a bunch of stuff. So I've just been kind of like flipping through, and I'll find one and then I'll read that one. But I've only read a few of them here and there. But I was flipping through the entire thing just to kind of see what's in here, and there's a lot. I mean, a lot of Egyptian stuff.
Real quick, just to say something about the Egyptian stuff in terms of New Testament. Like the only thing I can really say for certain, for sure, is that there are certain things about like the conception of Mary, as well as in terms of like artistic representations of her conception of Jesus, that seemed to reek along the lines of how Horus was conceived in terms of the law concept and how it interacts with sperm, with the divine sperm, and all this bunch of stuff. It's really sort of convoluted. It's hard to get into and explain if you guys don't know what you're talking, or what it is. But real quick, have you guys read a document called Study of the Law Concept by Louis B. Zofar?
I haven't.
Nope.
Right.
Okay. His text specifically, it's been updated to conform to modern times, but you could probably find a PDF copy in there. It talks about how the law concept actually interacts with the concept of parthenogenesis, i.e., virginal first creation. So it's kind of, again, it's hard to describe unless you've actually sort of studied this subject before. But basically what it is that it's a concept one which Horus wasn't actually conceived of by Isis directly. Like her Ba was conceived, and therefore posthumously her Ba ended up conceiving Horus inside her. So essentially, there wasn't any kind of physical, sexual fornication with the mummified corpse of Osiris. It was actually like the spiritual conception of Isis and her Ba. And her Ba gets conceived, therefore she gets conceived. Again, like I said, it's convoluted. It's really esoteric. It's some really esoteric kind of shit.
Can you do us a favor and type the title and the author in the chat box? Might be easier for us to find it.
Yeah, sure. I'll do that right now. Let me find. Hold on.
Yeah, there's a bunch of good stuff in this one, like from story of Daniel. Daniel lifted up his face. His skin was glowing.
Does it have anything about? Does it have anything about the Eden story?
Well, that's all throughout the Enuma Elish, big time. But I don't know. There's someone posted. I think it was Path of Abraham posted this really cool Egyptian piece of artwork that had looked like it showed the ark with I think 7 people in it. And let me see if I can find it.
Okay, got the text. It's actually here. Right, there you guys go. You can download it offline from the actual site itself. It's from the Studies in Ancient Oriental Civilization, so it's published by them.
Yeah.
This text, by the way, doesn't go directly into the parallels I was just talking about. This allows you to sort of extrapolate further from information regarding the quote-unquote virginal conception of Horus, if you want to call it that. I personally don't, because it's just kind of a misnomer given how convoluted the whole thing is. But yeah, it's an interesting read to the least. Go ahead, Ed. Sorry.
Oh, I was just tangent anyhow, sort of. But the Egyptian stuff. This Gary Greenberg, has anybody heard of him? He just goes to town about all kinds of Egyptian connections in the Old Testament, and a lot of it I haven't seen anywhere else, and it's like I wonder how much of this is just seeing Mary's face on toast.
Oh man, I'm gonna have to use that.
If he's at
That's
all part of the, I just gotta say this. If he's at all part of like the Black Hebrew Nation or whatever, chances are you're better off avoiding him, given how given how belligerent they tend to get with all this stuff.
well, that sort of ties into so, like most of the people on here either saw my article today or commented on it, and I've had a few interesting comments. It's one of those things where it's like, do you engage or not engage? Because some people, no matter what the topic, will just explode with hatred at anything, and it's just
What do you mean? What are
terrifying.
you talking about, Daniel? People don't just explode in hatred about anything. Come on.
Yeah, I know, Ed. Not you. Never you. Well, Chicago, University of Chicago, that's always a good sign. David, I wrote an article today about engaging or disengaging with the Christ myth theory, and it's just something I've been mulling over my head right now. How I think how certain individuals um, don't behave in a manner I think worthy of scholarly engagement and inquiry, and it's one of those reasons why I think debate about the historicity of Jesus either needs to change or at least be like either needs to change or maybe just be dropped in some sense. So yeah.
We lost one of the most angry and irrational voices in that uncivil part of that debate with Morris Casey. I mean, he really went off a deep end toward the last years with his assistant just echoing what he was saying, and he was just nasty. I mean, he was just it brought that level way down. There are some others too who just really, they just belittle everything that. And I'm trying to think of cases where mythicists do that to historicists, but I can't. All I can, well,
Oh,
maybe.
you can read my article because some of them were just like absolutely. The one who comes to my mind is this individual named Kenneth Humphreys, and he had pictures of Hoffman, Casey, and Fisher, um, Joseph Hoffman, Maurice Casey, and Stephanie Fisher, and the photo of Casey, for example, is Casey has sunburn and he's wearing a Hawaiian shirt, and he's sunburnt pink, and the caption of the photo is Casey's been out in the sun too long, and it's just like, why is this necessary? And very Stephanie Fisher, she has her photo, and he belittles her. He says, he calls her a cheerleader. And, say what you will about that. She has a PhD, and you, she's not. She has her own arguments, and he's calling her a mere cheerleader for these two scholars. It's just, yeah.
She does come off as a cheerleader, I gotta say, though. I've read, in just sort of a morbid fascination, a couple of years ago, I was reading the stuff she was saying, and it was like, it very much, it was amazing how she would just pile on, and those two were plenty nasty toward mythicists. I mean, I can't remember any instances. I just remember spending literally hours sitting there on my iPad, just fascinated by how nasty people could get, and she really
Well,
just, yeah.
I think shots have been fired on both sides. I won't disagree, and that's sort of my point, that the way this debate is being conducted at the moment is just not. It's just not how academic debate or dialogue should be taken.
I agree. I agree. There are some of the characters. I'm just going to come out and say who I'm talking about. they just seem so volatile that you just maybe I won't. They just seem so volatile that you just don't even want to engage because you're just afraid of what they might come back and say. And that's true not just in Christ mythicism. I mean, it's true among some of these atheist activists too. There are there are powder kegs that you just don't want to touch. And
Yeah. And like I said in my post, like I've considered working on something on the Christ myth theory, but because of just how volatile it can be, I might just stick with Marcion.
well, I don't know.
We need research on Marcion also, so I mean that's a good place to be working.
What's that? Sorry, Wayne, I missed that.
We need a lot more research on Marcion, so we need research in both areas. I mean, they're both very fertile fields, but. So.
Well, Marcion's getting more popular.
So is the Christ myth theory, though. They're at the same time, both sides are getting more popular.
Okay. Within traditional academic communities in Germany, in particular, and England, Marcion is getting more popular. So there we go.
You got 20 people reading the books instead of 10.
Yeah. Yeah, so we got 5 people writing books and 20 people reading them, yeah. No, I'm trying to get my way through this giant German text on Marcion at the moment, and I'm just hoping it will be translated at some point. I doubt it, but hoping. Just write a pseudonym. Tempting, David. It's not so much a pseudonym, it's more about time management. Plus, I want to get back to honor and shame, and phallic honor and shame in the Greco-Roman Jewish world. So much field of study, so little time.
I think personally, I would like to have a. As far as I understand it, Daniel, you're not really. You're kind of skeptical about the mythicist position, right?
Oh, I reject it outright.
Okay.
I am. Yeah, how to put this?
Well, no. So my point is, if you for having a person who rejects the mythicist position but is willing to respectfully entertain it and actually discuss it would be pretty refreshing, actually, because I can't think of somebody who does that. I mean, Ehrman sure didn't in his book "Did Jesus Exist?"
I think once again, okay, we've talked about this before. I think people are too harsh on Ehrman. I really do. I don't think. Look, I have my problems with that book too. Don't get me wrong. And that book is one of the reasons why I am thinking about writing a book that definitely would not make mythicists happy, but at least they could go to bed easy, or at least go to the internet easy, knowing that I gave most of them a fair trial anyway. So yeah.
That would be refreshing. It really would. It's and people. I mean, Bob Price is the one that they can't dismiss because of his 2 PhDs, but they still try to dismiss him by saying, well, he isn't teaching at an institution, so he doesn't really count. But there is this credentialism that just disgusts me about people that have dismissed these guys, and they take.
I just gotta say real quick. I just take huge umbrage with the issue of saying that he doesn't have a teaching position anywhere. As if that really matters, to be perfectly honest. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't really take up like the mythicist position myself. Hard line. I used to at one point in time, but now I don't. But for me, at the very least, I would say that they have a point here and there to be made. But they should be set out to be fair. It should be set out to be fair and say, okay, what's your point to be made on the dating of the Gospels? What is your point to be made on the consensus for which the Gospels were made in terms of dating? And to me, to be perfectly honest, unless we can have more reliable methods than paleographic dating for like one of the earliest manuscripts, unless we actually have a way to date it, I guess you could say more accurately than not, then I don't think we're going to be able to resolve that particular matter. Then there are things along the lines, just the responses that ethicists get. I mean, for me, I'm kind of like Daniel in this, in that I'll entertain their viewpoint, even though I might not necessarily agree with it. My issue with Ehrman is that I'm as hard on Ehrman as I can possibly be, simply because if he didn't show such a pedigree for misrepresenting the positions of ethicists and their claims and what they said and what they've done, I don't think that there would have been much of a problem with it. But that's me speaking, of course, as a non-ethicist who sympathizes with the position. So, that's where I stand.
Yeah. I'm somewhat sympathetic to them as well, because it's like there's no ways about it. It's a fringe view. Like it's so fringe and minority, which is fine, because one of the reasons why I sympathize with it is I don't agree with Hugh, so I'm in a fringe myself. So I sort of relate just in that sort of fact. But in terms of I definitely, going to what you were saying, Ed, the credentialism is definitely, it's made its point, but it's now become a problem. And what I mean by that is some of the people who have talked on this issue simply do not have the credentials. They have no academic background, no prior training, and in some cases, they really don't know what they're talking about, and that just shows through. That's one thing. The whole teaching position thing is another. We're in an economic crisis. Like, there are people who went to Harvard who don't have jobs right now when it comes to, the New Testament. I'm trying to get a job. Like, once I'm done with my PhD, when I get into a program, I'm entering in a very volatile academic community, and it's even worse because I'm an atheist. So,
Right.
I could be the most mainstream guy there is. Like, Jesus was an eschatological prophet. I agree with Q. I agree with every single dating. Oh, but you won't get a job. So the teaching position thing, I absolutely agree with you.
It strikes me as, and it just strikes me as pretty arbitrary how Ehrman. I mean, I'm going to come back to him. He threw this thing up about the teaching position. It's like I just kind of laughable. It's like, the only people qualified to write books about Laestadianism are people that spent at least 40 years being Laestadians, preferably in the conservative Laestadian branch of the Hademan schism. That's me. So I'm the only one that's qualified to ever write a book on that. And anybody else that does, well, you got to pay your dues. Go spend 40 years in the church. It just seems so arbitrary. It's just like, oh, put that up there, and now you can discredit what he has to say.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you've. It seems like you've listened to one of his SBL lectures, but Ehrman gave a lecture where one of the problems he's finding is his PhD students, particularly the younger ones, when they talk over coffee about what they want to do in their career, what they want to do is they want to work at the university and they want to write popular books. And Ehrman says that's great, but the problem is that's not all we can be doing. We need to, as academics, we need to be engaging in the hardcore scholarship and pay our dues, so to speak, like he did, blah, blah, blah. But something that I find, and I agree with him to a point, but we're in a very different academic climate where in order to kind of stay in a job these days, you've got to have a Facebook profile with so many likes. You've got to have a blog on the side with so many followers. Universities actually care about your social media preference and things like that. And the credentialism is a bit of a problem with some people who engage. But like I said before, and agreeing with Shade, I think the credentialism has served its point to weed out the pseudo-scholars, the people who really have no place making comments like this.
Let me kind of probe a little bit here. A friend of mine, I don't know him real well, but I've had the privilege of a couple hours of conversation and correspondence. Is Frank Zindler. The guy is an absolute genius. He knows like a dozen languages. He's spent tons of time, researching, decades, reading, and just amazing his insights. He does not have a PhD. In fact, his degree is not even related to the subject. So he was just pretty much dismissed by Ehrman. Ehrman wouldn't even really Ehrman's response to Zindler's questions was basically, could you send a copy of your CV? And I mean, what's your take on that?
Full disclosure, I have not read Zindler. Not widely anyway. Once again, it's one of those things where it's like, if I did embark on this project, I would have a lot of reading to do. I don't have research assistants to do it for me. I would do it myself. Yes, I have read. Fun fact for you, Wayne. Sorry, just going on a tangent. Roland Boer from the University of Newcastle, who wrote the chapter on the German pestilence, about the 18th century and 19th century rise of Jesus mythicism, was one of my supervisors, and he supervised my review of Richard Carrier's book, which I'm trying to get published at the moment. So, yes, I did.
That's awesome. I was going to say I accidentally bought 2 copies of this, so I actually have a spare copy. I don't know who to give it to, though. And we'll probably want to trade for something, but...
I volunteer as tribute. I'll see what I got. Anyway,
yeah, I ordered it and then forgot that I ordered it and then bought it from somewhere else, and then I got the other one in the mail and was like, wait a second, I forgot that I ordered the first one.
Yeah, my people will talk to your people. But in terms of your issue, Ed, yeah, it's some of the stuff was in Ehrman's book was, if they don't have a PhD, they're not worth looking into. And one of my issues with Ehrman's book is the categorization, where sure he somewhat distinguishes between Freak and Gandry and Carrier and Price, somewhat, but it's very, very minor. Like, he doesn't really isolate these views. Like, for example, in the study of the historical Jesus, we would have eschatological prophet, social reformer, mover, shaker sort of person. Even though they're in the same sort of field, they're very distinct individuals and arguments that represent these things. And if you were going to do a proper study of mythicism, you would really need to make those distinctions about who's in what camp, what views do they represent, where do they get, what credentials do these people have? It's a valid question. What is their educational background? What are their sources? And but the thing I keep in mind, and I know it's probably the weakest apologetic excuse for Ehrman, is it was a popular book for HarperCollins. So maybe we should take a deep breath and understand that it had a certain audience in mind. It wasn't meant to be the fundamental stake in the heart of mythicism. It was his response to a bunch of emails he kept getting for years on end. Primarily, I think that's what it represents.
That is the case. I just want to say that is very true, and I do keep reminding people that. The problem is that you have assholes on the net who seem to use it for that exact purpose of saying that, Ehrman wrote this book. Did you read Ehrman's book? He really destroys mythicism. Yeah, and in the same book he accuses Murdoch of fabricating evidence, which he didn't. What's your take on that?
What's that? Sorry, I missed that. Sorry.
The Petra, the cock statue and whatnot. When she accuses
Oh,
Murdoch of hand drawing her own evidence for herself on that, where he accuses her of that. I mean, that one was just, oh, really? And his defense, the way in which he actually backpedals is just, wow, really? I should just buy the guy a fucking bicycle at that point.
Okay, what I'll say on that is I know what you're talking about. I read into it. The statue may exist, but I'm willing to bet my degree that it has absolutely nothing to do with the Apostle Peter and representations of him. Does it, like, I don't think Murdoch made it up. I think that's pretty clear. Is it in the Vatican? I don't know. I doubt it. But yeah, accusing her of hand drawing it is, that was a little low. But yeah, that's one of those minutiae things that I don't really have too much invested either way. It doesn't make or break the quality or terribleness of the book, either way.
Yeah, for you it doesn't, and I'm not saying it should for you. For me, however, being the person that I am, it's like little things like that that kind of hint at me as to whether or not the person actually did the serious legwork that they claim that they did. Like I can ignore stuff like pronunciation, differentiations, things like you say tomato, I say tomato, that kind of stuff. I can ignore like simple itty bitty mistakes, like you're about 5 years off on a date here and there. But if you accuse someone of fabricating a source, you better have good fucking evidence for it. And the moment I saw it, it was like, really, okay, let me go back and see that. I look back at the source, see where she got it from, and apparently she got it from Barbara Walker, who got it from another source, who actually cataloged it in the Vatican, in the Vatican library, and I'm like, oh man, this is bad. It's like, if you can't do the serious work that only takes me about 5 minutes to find out something by using the net, to me that just screams laziness. But that's my particular issue. It doesn't have to be yours. It's just mine.
Well, like I've said in my Goodreads review of Ehrman's book, it's a very good introduction to what the hell people are talking about. But if nothing else, it's a good way to sort of, if you are brave of heart, it's a good way to step your toe in the water and discover a whole new world that you may never have wanted to discover before. Because like I said in my article today, it's a ferocious world. So yeah, not for the faint of heart.
Personally, I believe Josh McDowell's The Evidence Demands a Verdict is far more reliable than that, but that's me. And for the record, I hate apologists, so there you go, right there.
Oh dear.
I wanna come back to probing you here, Daniel. If without knowing anything about Frank Zindler's writings, if just knowing that he has spent this much time, being this autodidact that he is, would you entertain his arguments seriously, or would you just kind of shrug him off and say, well, what kind of credentials do you have?
Admittedly, it's my first response would be, when someone says the name of a book and a scholar that I should take seriously and read, I'll be honest, the first thing, it's like that old thing in Harry Potter, you want to find out where its brain is. I want to know, what credential does this person have? Where do they teach? Where did they teach? Where did they do their training? I think there's a fair question to ask. So in Zindler's case, he doesn't have that stuff. But when you preface it in the way of, well, he's been working here and here, he's very well read. I'm willing to entertain the idea. And in a topic like mythicism, he seems pretty unavoidable. So you would have to engage with him at least. Um, if for nothing else, he is a vocal and influential person in this topic. If that answers your question.
Well, I'm just not hearing a whole lot of. I'm not hearing a whole lot of. He might actually have something valuable to say from his self-study. I'm hearing the academic reluctance to even acknowledge that, which, I've run into that myself in my own field, so I'm familiar with being on the other end of the table from that.
I think it's best to go ahead, and this is my personal advice for you, Daniel. I think it's best to go ahead and dispense with the whole what's degrees that they get and look at that like last, for example, in your analysis of whether or not the person is worthwhile, and look more towards like where exactly did they publish their works, under what journals did they publish, under which academic publishers actually took up the book. Was it Oxford? Was it Yale? Was it a that kind of stuff.
Like I said,
I look for.
No, I agree, and that's a part of my initial sort of. That's in the matrix of where do they study, who published them, where do they work, who did they study under, and maybe that's academic elitism, but I think it's valid. I'm not saying, and I'm not making a special case for Zimler. I'm just saying about things in general. Otherwise, anyone can throw a book at you, and I feel like your hands might be tied to read everything, no matter who they are, where they come from. But if if Zimler has the attention of the public for good reasons, for bad reasons, I don't know, whatever, he needs to be engaged with and engaged with properly. So that alone, I think. But in terms of like, hey, are you willing to give somebody a shot? I'm in this forum with other people who, because we're lay people for the most part who are interested in talking about these topics. So, unless we all had PhDs in this hangout, none of us should be talking. But we're all students, we're all talking, we're all engaging, we're all discussing. So yeah, there's definitely room for that. And
I mean, and we don't have PhDs in the facial hair of the pre-exilic prophets. I mean, that might disqualify all of us from certain discussions, the way some of these guys think. So.
Yeah, look, my point is to you, absolutely, credentialism aside, if someone's got something to say that is well researched, argued well, and all that jazz, then yes, they should deserve attention. I would never deny somebody that.
Cool. Go ahead.
If that's what you're trying to get me to say, I'll say it.
Okay.
I can't speak about Zindler. I don't know him from a bar of soap. That's my issue.
Right.
Yeah, in the case of mythicism, I mean, if you have people who are, I mean, for lack of a better term, because I can't think of a better one right now, poster boys for the theory, yeah, I mean, if you really, if your goal is to confront their theory, you have to address them, regardless of if they're prominent figures of behind that proposition. Everything else, whether they went to school or not, doesn't even matter. But if they're just if they, let's say they're Christ mythicists, but even in the world of Christ myth theory, they're like very not well known, or fringe even within the world of Christ mythicism, then that's a different story. But like I said, if they're the bigwigs of Christ mythicism, then yeah, you'd have to.
Yeah, exactly. That's. Thank you for saying it better than me, Doug.
There's an interesting, entertaining parallel. I wrote my first book was two of these things, and they're both self-published. There's no, no imprimatur there from any publisher, but it was basically a 700-page expose of my old church, of its history and its misinterpretations of the Bible, and I spent a year working on the thing, 180 references and tons of footnotes and citations everywhere, and it was kind of amusing the responses that came back from the elders of the church, which is, well, I don't really have the the proper spirit. Their reliance was on the spiritual. That I'm not interpreting the Bible text properly when I point out that you can beat your slave to within an inch of his life. Well, I'm taking things out of context, and so you can see kind of the opposite form of credentialism there, where you just can't possibly understand this stuff, the gnosis. You just can't know. And it's made me very jaded about claims of any kind in that regard. Just take the ideas for what they are and see. But I also respect your point that you'd be there all day reading fringe stuff, and
Yeah. I mean, do we really have to read Zechariah Sitchin to know he's a nutter? Not really.
No, you don't. All you have to do is just listen to one of his lectures.
Yeah.
Yes. It's one of those things where it's difficult. Speaking of the credentialism thing, actually, Aslan's book, A Zealot, something that got brought up a lot was his credentials, and it wasn't. I'm not talking about the Muslim credential. That's not the issue. But in the big Fox interview thing, he kept saying, "I have a PhD in religion," and he does, but it's a PhD technically in interdisciplinary studies. Once again, that's fine. I love interdisciplinary studies. And his main focus was on, I think it was on texts of the Quran and things like that in a modern context. I'm probably misunderstanding his doctoral thesis. But, something that a few people jumped on him about is like, yes, you have a credential, but you're not technically an ancient historian, and not one for early Christianity at that. And so does he...
I just want to point out his credentialism is a PhD thesis was regarding Islamic jihadism in the world of terrorism today and how it relates to the Muslim faith in today's in contemporary times. So it seems to be a geopolitical person with regards to his studies on Islam, which is great actually. We need more people like that.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Devin, for clarifying. And I apologize for speaking out of my realm, but my main point there was something Ehrman talked about on his blog was that he has no problem with Aslan writing a book about Jesus, but it's more the fact that he wrote a book, and what he kept insisting was that he was a religion scholar, therefore he was justified in writing this thesis. So it was a very interesting thing of sort of reverse credentialism when people weren't questioning where his credentials were, is that he had to constantly sort of defend himself. Do you have opinions on that, Ed?
I think you made a great point.
Plus, Aslan pretty much ripped off Brandon without giving him any credit.
I know, not a single footnote to Brandon at all.
Yeah, that was something that kind of bothered me going, sort of skimming through his book, trying to look through the bibliography and notes and whatnot, is that there wasn't any reference towards Brandon. How the hell could you reference this thesis without including Brandon in it? It's like, he's like the cornerstone of this thesis.
And he had Brandon's book open the whole time he was writing Zealot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I can't really speak for that because I've only gone through the notes specifically, so...
That being said, I did like the book.
It was very well written.
Yep.
He's a very talented communicator. I'll give him that. And a lot of his stuff is very interesting, but it's nothing I haven't heard before, and better. But yeah, it's yeah.
I did hear quite a lot about some historical inaccuracies with regards to certain geographical locales being described by certain types of lakes here and there. There that weren't really there actually. These kinds of things. Well, what's up with that specifically?
I can't speak to all of it, but Michael Bird from my homeland of Australia, who works at Ridley College, he pounced all over Aslan's historical inaccuracies to exactly the things you're talking about sort of practices of the temple, geographic positions, some of the stuff, the way he sort of construed the Jesus material. Bird thinks is a very creative way. I think the phrase was that Aslan lets his imagination go wild a bit too much instead of historical sort of critical analysis. But it's not that type of book, is what some people would say.
I thought his interpretation of gives Caesar's things to Caesar and God's things to God was just way, way off. Really, really stretching it. But
What was
that's where I felt he was being really, really creative.
What was his interpretation on that?
Well, basically that Jesus was saying, give Caesar's things to Caesar, so the coin, that's Caesar's, but give God's things to God. So the entire land of Israel, let's take it over and kick the Romans out. That's what he says Jesus was saying in that statement.
Which is funny, because if you want to make a more revolutionary claim in that passage, Brandon does it. In Brandon's analysis of that line, Brandon's argument is that the irony is that nothing belongs to Caesar. God created everything. God created the universe. Therefore, give nothing to Caesar. That's a much better, violent, revolutionary, let's take over Israel. I think that's a much better way to interpret it than what Aslan presents.
Yeah, and even the thing with Brandon, I don't quite buy, but
neither do I. But it's still, it's just once again, this is what happens when a New Testament scholar actually does the work, I think. But he sold a crap ton of books, so
yeah.
And I'm always happy when people talk about the historical Jesus and New Testament studies. That always makes me happy.
Can I ask a quick question that's totally unrelated? I got to run in a few minutes, but I'm curious why Jay talked about Yahweh Elohim. Why did he use both of those words?
Who?
Wasn't there like a combination going on? Because originally Elohim was like the highest God, the most high, and Yahweh was like one of his sons or whatever. But then eventually they ended up just combining them, and so Jay's reflecting that combination.
Okay, that makes sense.
I could be way off, but that sounds like something I've
Part
heard.
of the documentary hypothesis is that J and E are the two oldest sources,
Yeah.
and if they were, as a pair, combined together before the other sources were merged in, and probably the redactor that combined J and E put the dual names on that situation there.
Oh. So J would have just used Yahweh then, according to that. Okay.
Anyway, guys, it's late in Kansas, so I really need to run. But thanks again for a wonderful Hangout session, and look, I'll see you guys for Parables of War on Sunday.
Awesome.
And, yeah.
Thanks,
Chapter
Daniel.
310.
Interesting. Thanks, guys.
See you later.
All right, see you next
All right.
time.
Yeah,
All right.
I think I think if so it's not that J had already by himself combined Yahweh Elohim.
Right. Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
I'm not sure. I'm asking Wayne.
I'm not
Oh.
sure either. That's what I'm thinking it is. I need to study it more myself.
Okay.
But I know there's talk among the document hypothesis proponents that those two documents were merged before the other was merged in. So
Oh, so J and E were combined by someone before
P and D were
P
added
were
in. Yeah.
okay.
For the record, there were also various variations of the term El and various titles of El that were also combined into one. Like there was El Elyon, then there was El Elyon Elohim, then there was El Elohim, then there was Elohim, then there was Elohim El Elyon. These kinds of things. It's really kind of convoluted if you get down to it, but. One of the more interesting ones was how they combined El Elyon with El Elyon Elohim, and how they became the sort of the same reference to the same deity, when in fact they were actually referencing two entirely different deities. El Elyon Elohim were originally two deities separate unto themselves, but they were then combined into one deity. Then El Elyon Elohim Loim or something like that. I can never pronounce the name specifically, but it was deity that was below El instead, and he became thus the same with El. So yeah, it was this weird convoluted way of how textual criticism kind of works just almost baffles me. I say almost because I'm still able to mostly grasp it.
Can I amend what I said earlier?
Yeah.
Yeah, by all means.
Yeah. In Richard Elliott Friedman's book, The Bible with Sources Revealed, he color codes it, and he has the Elohim as the later redactor. He has a separate color for the redactor of J and E, and he doesn't color code it for that redactor. He color codes it for the later redactor.
Okay.
What his reasoning is, I don't know yet, but
I wonder if Bellhausen did that too.
Definitely a must-have source for the documentary hypothesis.
yeah, it is. I haven't read enough of it yet, but it's fascinating. I mean, and every page is fascinating.
Also, real quick, one I'm not too sure if you guys have read it, but have you guys read the book called Farewell to the Yahwist by any chance?
Mm-mm.
I've heard of it, not read it.
Yeah. Okay. For those of you guys who haven't heard it, it's basically a book that sort of brings into light various European scholastic advances in the field of Old Testament textual criticism. One which, instead of having a series of redactors and people who actually take the text and start editing it and whatnot, instead what they have is that they have the text as representing competing traditions within one another that eventually gain attraction within the book inevitably. Somewhat similar to how the various teachings of, like, let's say, for example, the apostles, if you believe that they necessarily existed, how their teachings eventually made its way into the New Testament. Somewhat similar to that.
All right.
I think there's a couple places too where Elohim is plural, and most of the time the verb in connection with Elohim will be singular, but in a few places it's plural, meaning that whoever was redacting it or whatever missed a couple spots essentially.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fascinating, as Bob likes to say, endlessly fascinating. And you guys, good information. So I'm going to bail out, but thanks.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Ed. It was fun having you.
Good meeting you.
Bye. Yeah, same here. Bye.
I see, Ed. Bye.
Anyone got anything else?
No, I'm probably gonna head off right now. I gotta watch a couple of videos by the Nostalgia Critic that he put up there recently. So yeah, I'll see you guys later.
All right, see you later, Devin. I'm gonna read up some more on that First Timothy Luke quote because I want to figure out. I'm sure a bunch of scholars have probably written about that, so I'll have to find what books it's mentioned in.
Regarding the formation of the New Testament, have you read the first edition of the New Testament by David Trobisch that Bryce recommends often?
I haven't read that yet. That's the one where he goes into Polycarp, right?
Trobisch doesn't actually give Polycarp's name in this book. I think that was later discussion in private emails or something after this book was published, I think.
Oh, okay. Or did he maybe in a different book did
Maybe
he lay out that
yeah.
theory?
But this book was hard for me to follow. But he lays out the reasons that he believes the New Testament existed as a bound codex, having the 27 books it has now before the end of the 2nd century. So it wasn't just isolated manuscripts. Trobisch believes it was actually published as a hardbound volume at that time. Maybe dozens of copies having been handmade of it. And Trobisch also says that there's lots of places where the editor redacts the individual texts he's including in order to kind of create connections between them. And pretty much half of this book, Trobisch is talking about those connections.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah, I don't have any Trobisch books yet. Like I said, I'm still just getting my feet wet into this whole thing, so I'm way behind on my reading. Wish I could just plug something into my brain and upload all the information.
The other book by Trobisch that I haven't really started reading it yet, but it's Paul's letter collections, Tracing the Origins. I think this one might have been published first, actually. I forget exactly. I think it was the older of the two books.
Have you read that one?
I've only read this one, and I actually got kind of fatigued reading this and didn't read it so thoroughly to the end. But I read about 2/3 of it carefully, and then kind of started skimming it in the last third. But this one I haven't even opened yet.
Do you know what his general, approach is in that book?
I don't really, no.
I liked, there's a book, it's in the public domain by Thomas Whitaker, where he talks about Paul's epistles, and he's basically reiterating von Manen's work on them, and it's free audiobook on LibriVox.
One of my issues with the first edition of the New Testament is I personally wasn't able to follow his argument at the end enough to really know if he's being persuasive or not. Throughout the book, he says things that seem interesting, but I'm always had the feeling that he was a little bit short of actually proving his points.
I get that feeling with a lot of scholarship, because that's kind of, it's hard to know any of these things decisively, so you have to make your best case, And I think there's a strong tendency in general to oversell the certainty of any particular theory on anything in the Bible. Because it's pretty much, as far as I can tell, it's pretty much a lot of it's just up in the air. But obviously authors want to get the point across that they believe their view is correct.
Well, I think there's different parts of it that are easier to prove and demonstrate than others. I mean,
Yeah,
I think the mountain of evidence for the documentary hypothesis is, can't be ignored. I mean, there may be other hypotheses that address the evidence maybe in a better way, but they still have to address the evidence, and there's lots of it.
yeah. I think it's undeniable that the Pentateuch at least came from a bunch of several sources at least. That's probably undeniable. But if it was actually the particular 4 sources, that's a little less certain. But still pretty good theory.
And if you haven't picked this up from me over time, the other thing that I'm pretty much the strongest convinced of in New Testament studies is that Paul's letter collection was originally, or the oldest evidence we have for it is in the Marcionite canon, and that the version we have in the Christian Bibles today are edited versions of, expanded to be about a third longer. The ancient Christians basically claimed that Marcion had cut down the originals, but comparing the texts, I'm strongly convinced that's not plausible. The Catholic versions are expansions of the Marcionite versions, not vice versa. And that's probably the thing I'm most strongly convinced about in all of biblical studies, to be honest.
That Marcion's version of Luke?
Version of the Pauline epistles in particular.
Oh, okay. They were much shorter.
About a third shorter.
Yeah, so they were padded out, as Dr. Price always says, by someone. Yeah, the whole Marcion thing was weird because his denial that the God Jesus represented wasn't the God who created the world is like, well, makes you wonder, like, if he was reading source materials that were way different than what we have, or he was doing some funny business himself with editing stuff. I don't know. Because it seems difficult to convincingly separate the two, given what we have today. But if he was working with earlier stuff that didn't make the connection so clear, maybe he had a good point. I don't know.
I think one issue I kind of had reading David Trowbridge's book was that he doesn't seem to take Marcion into account enough.
Who doesn't take Marcion into account?
I don't remember Trowbridge actually taking Marcionite's Apostolicon and things into account enough in the First Edition of the New Testament.
Yeah. So do you think Marcion had a more accurate view of the historical Jesus and what he was all about than Orthodoxy did? Or do you think Marcion kind of went off on his own weird tangent?
Well, I think Orthodoxy is a amalgamation of views that came in the late 2nd century in order to try to get some unity among the church.
Well, let me rephrase that. Do you think Marcion had a better idea of historical Jesus and what he was all about versus whoever it was at the time who was believing that the God of Jesus and the God of the Old Testament were the same God?
I don't know. One of the questions I have about that is if Marcion's gospel is one of the older ones, how come it seems more like Luke, which is one of the more recent Gospels, and less like Mark? That just seems bizarre to me. But there also seems to be the connection that Mark is named after Marcion, actually. It's, Marcion actually means little Mark. So, I mean, it's like, there's a lot of questions in the field that I haven't really put together in my head yet on that aspect. I think the original, though, idea of Jesus was a Jewish conception of him allegorically, and I really do, and what we have in the Gospels. And I don't think that Marcion necessarily understood that. I think he may have already been living at a time where that was misunderstood.
Now, is that based off of that thing you sent me a while ago about the Gospel of Mark as one giant allegory?
Related, yeah. I don't know. I don't know if that's the best presentation of that thesis I've seen. Is by Robert Oh, no, I'm sorry, not Robert. R.M. Price. No, it's not. R.G. Price. R.G. Price, yeah.
Yeah.
Erase that. But I don't exploration of it, but it's the best exploration I've seen. I'm actually looking for another book that explores that avenue better than R.G. Price does. And I don't think R.G. Price is doing original research either, just based on how he writes and how he recycles Doherty's theories in his other articles. I think he's just rehashing. So I need to really learn who he's rehashing from.
Yeah. I was going to say something and it just went right out of my head. Oh, have you read John Dominic Crossan's book? What is the name of it? The Power of Parables, where he's arguing that, like the parables that Jesus uses, he's arguing that the whole Jesus story is a giant parable.
That's on my to-read list. I know Readar's recommended it several times. I don't have a copy yet, and I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, well, it sounds similar to what you're talking about.
It seems to take a little bit of a different approach, but maybe not. Maybe because I'm not familiar with it, I can't tell if it uses the same approach or not.
Yeah. What might be something you want to read? Anyway. What's in it, David? Just a bunch of New Testament Apocrypha? David's saying he bought a bunch of apocryphal stuff. Or a collection of apocryphal writings. Old Testament Apocrypha? Yeah. A lot of Bibles still have that in there. Like the Catholics still have it, and a lot of the scholarly study Bibles will have a lot of it in there too.
For the Apocrypha, I like using my Septuagint that has it in Greek on one column and English on the other.
Yeah.
Most of them are translated from the Septuagint anyway. I mean, I think we may have found Hebrew copies of some of them, but I think the Septuagint is still the major basis for the English editions.
Do you guys have or know of, and I think Ruben was helping me out with this question a long time ago, but I forgot to write the name of the book down, or I could be imagining this, or it was someone else, but I wanted to get my hands on and I don't even remember what they're called, but a book of the three synoptics in column form, where it'll show you any particular like pericope or section. It'll show you each author's or each gospel's writing on that, so you can compare them side by side, right in columns next to each other. Does that kind of layout have a name? Column, Gospels in column? I don't know. But I wanted to have something like that, so I didn't have to have like 3 Bibles or 3 windows on
Gospel Parallel?
Bible Gateway open.
They're called Gospel Parallels.
Oh, is that how it is? Gospel Parallels? Okay. I'd love to actually get all 4 of them, but I'm assuming people don't do that. I don't know.
I'd like to see a whole entire Bible parallels because, I mean, even, there's parallels between, like, Samuel and Kings, but there's also parallels between, Genesis and Jeremiah in places and things that are interesting to see.
Oh, Ruben, this is great. Thank you. Do you happen to know of any books that have them all written out, though? Or that maybe that might be too cumbersome? I don't know. Man, I was listening to something earlier in the week, and they were saying that Matthew was the only gospel that had the Sermon on the Mount, which was...
I think you misunderstood. That the sermon is in both Matthew and Luke. But I
Yeah,
think Matthew places it on a mountain, Luke places it on a plain. And so in order for scholars to refer to the differences between them, they call one the Sermon on the Mountain, they call the other the Sermon on the Plain.
and what about the stuff in Mark that's in there? Well,
That I
Mark
don't
has it
know.
all over the place. Like, I'm looking at this parallel thing, and there are passages in Mark from what Matthew puts on the Sermon on the Mount, but in Mark they're like all throughout Mark in different places. Yeah, like here at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, he says, "For he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes." And then that's in Matthew chapter 7 on the Sermon on the Mount. And then in Matthew chapter 1, "For he taught them as one that had authority and not as the scribes." So in a completely different context. It makes you wonder if, well, no, it doesn't make you wonder, but, well, actually it does. So Luke, I wonder if Matthew and Luke both took these little things from Mark and put them in their sermons. But then it's weird that Matthew and Luke both did that in a similar way. Did they know each other? See, that's another thing where, like, I need to read Mark Goodacre's book because he might talk about that. Because there's so much similarity, it looks like, between Matthew and Luke as far as what's covered in this like Luke chapter 6. Looks like there's a ton of stuff from Luke chapter 6 that's from Mark's Sermon on the Mount, and Luke chapter 11, 12 too. Weird. I'll have to read more about that. Thanks, Ruben.
Yeah, personally, I think that Matthew knew Mark and used Mark in writing his gospel. I think the writer of the Marcionite gospel knew both, and I think the Gospel of Luke is a later revision to the Marcionite gospel.
Well, Goodacre argues that they both used Mark, but I think he says Luke used Matthew or something like that. I forget.
Yeah, Luke used Matthew and Mark.
Right, yeah.
But actually, I would say, though, that Luke is a revision of the Marcionite gospel, and it's the Marcionite gospel that used Matthew and Mark. Luke's a later revision, late 2nd century. So
Marcion used Matthew and Mark.
Yeah, or Marcion's gospel. Whether Marcion wrote it himself or got it from somewhere else, we don't know. But
Well, wouldn't you have had to be copied from Mark? Or Q?
no.
I mean, if he has verbatim stuff, I don't know. He'd have to have had it. Anyway, what do you guys think? You want to cut it off or what? Kind of out of questions.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I'm out of questions too. So I did have a question, I guess, for Mr. Price later. I should send to his show, but I'm not sure. It's kind of a generic question now, just kind of on form criticism of a particular Old Testament passage. The one where I think, remember that they, I should remember the details too. I'm going to embarrass myself if I get the details wrong. But where the witch conjures up, I think it was Samuel's soul, and then they talk, and they, Samuel's talking to them and things. I'm just curious from a form critical standpoint what ancient parallels are to that passage. If there's actually, commonplace to have seances and things like that, back at that time in that kind of context, or what. Or whether it's just a literary device that they're using, invented just for literary reasons.
Yeah, I have no clue about that.
I really didn't phrase the question very well, but yeah.
I'm not even familiar with those passages, so.
I didn't describe them well enough then. You probably do know them, I just described them poorly. I forget where they actually are, in fact.
You say it was in 1 Samuel?
I don't remember. I think I don't remember. It might be in Kings or something. I don't remember. But I think it was Samuel that is brought back from the dead, or his spirit.
Yeah, Samuel and the medium of Endor.
Yeah, that's it. Yes.
Yeah, that's 1 Samuel.
Yeah. But anyway, I was just curious about it from the form critical standpoint. What other writings are similar to that, and etc.
Yeah, I can't think of anything. That'd be a good question for him. Of course, I don't think he's done a Bible Geek in a while, from what John Felix was saying. He's been really busy with writing. He probably has a giant backlog.
Well, I have a backlog of Bible Geek episodes I still have to listen to. I think I've only caught a quarter of them from like the last 2 years.
I went through all of them once, and now I'm going through all of them again because as I learn more and more, I'm getting more and more out of each of the episodes. Some of the stuff's so out there for me, I just know nothing about it, and I'm like, huh? I just tune out. But now that I've learned a little more, like I'm getting more out of the podcast, and I'll probably go back and do it again once I get up to the current episode, whenever it is that I finish. David, I have a job where I can basically listen to it all day long, so I listen to a lot of audiobooks, and when I get bored with a book or whatever, I'll turn on the podcast for hours at a time, usually. So that's one perk of my job.
Mm-hmm.
Can listen to tons of audio information.
Are we still live? Yeah, we are.
Yeah, we are.
I was going to ask you what you do. I don't know if you want that to be live or not.
Oh, I'm a mail carrier.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you told me before. I forgot. Yeah.
I had a question of Dr. Price too, because he said in the past if he wasn't a Christ mythicist, he would probably go along with Brandon's zealot hypothesis. But in a book Dr. Price recommended, there was a footnote in A Myth of Innocence where I think it was Richard Horsley. Yeah. There was a book he wrote. Oh man. It wasn't Bandits, Prophets, and Messiahs that Ruben mentioned the other day. It was one of his other ones that covered similar material. But he was saying that the entire zealot hypothesis is totally anachronistic because what Josephus is actually talking about are the Sicarii, and they actually weren't active until the years leading up to the Jewish War starting in 66. So it wouldn't have been, Jesus couldn't have been a zealot because they weren't around at the time, according to Horsley. So I wanted to know what Dr. Price thought of that. I'm assuming he's aware of that and has his own reasons for why he probably thinks that isn't actually anachronistic.
Remember that if we don't take the Gospels as being accurate in their portrayal of Jesus, then we can't narrow down what decades Jesus, if he was historical, actually lived. If the Gospels are fictional, Jesus could have lived much earlier or much later and still been an inspiration for them.
Yeah, though that's true, but it's still curious that pretty much the entire Jesus tradition places him at a particular point in time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because of the Gospels, though. I mean, there's other.
Right, but they're all based off oral traditions, so.
Yeah. There's other traditions such as in Justin Martyr that placed Jesus as being decades later.
Yeah, but how many? I mean, that would have had to have been 30
Yeah.
years later. But then again, there was Judas of Galilee who had a revolt around the 6 or 7 CE. So maybe he wouldn't have been called a zealot, but he could have been something similar to what the zealots were all about at that time. So, I don't know. What do you mean, Ruben? Some other guy named Pilate? What do you mean Pilate not first century? Oh, you mean the Gospels placing him being killed by Pilate is not necessarily correct. Is that what you're saying? That it could have been later or earlier? Later, okay. If that's true, I wonder where the Pilate thing came from. I wonder why that came about. Anyway, that was one of my questions I wanted to send into him. But you said he already addressed it, so if I can find the episode, I'll skip the question. Reuben says, one view of Jesus links him with the Pharisees slain by Alexander Jannaeus. Oh, I remember him talking about that too. Who, while the most successful Hasmonean king, is regarded as basically the Antichrist in the Talmud. Alexander Jannaeus is regarded as the Antichrist? Yeah, okay. Now that's in response to David, right? Yeah, okay. Where does the late, possibly not Pilate, but later idea come from? Has anyone written on that or? Oh, that's right, because he said he lived till 50 or 60 or something, right? Irenaeus.
There's also the fact that if the second passage in Josephus that supposedly refers to Jesus really refers to the same Jesus, it places him in the later decade.
Which you're not talking about the for surely he was the Son of God.
No, the other one, I forget how to summarize it, but
yeah, I don't remember that one either because I always hear about the other one, the famous one.
yeah, but Josephus is talking about things in a later decade, so than when Jesus is supposed to have lived. So if they're going to claim that's talking about Jesus of the New Testament, then something's wrong with their chronology.
Do you know which book it comes out of? David's asking, War of the Jews or Histories?
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Let's just look this up. Jesus. By the way, I watched a really cool thing on YouTube. It was a dramatization kind of thing, but with narration of Josephus' account of his experiences in the war, And there was this really cool scene where I haven't read any of Josephus's works yet. I plan to, but I haven't yet. But where he's down in the well of the city he was defending, when the Romans I guess I guess he talks about this, but the Romans like snuck in at night and opened the gates and let all the soldiers in, and him and a bunch of his guys had gone down into this well, and they kind of drew lots to see who would kill each other, and Josephus was gonna go last, so everyone was like cutting each other's throats, and Josephus went last, and him and his friend, they didn't want to kill each other, so they both crawled out of the well. And I guess in Josephus' writing, he actually said that, he's been accused of figuring out in his head, like, because he numbered every third man will kill his neighbor. But the claim is that Josephus figured that out ahead of time before he gave that suggestion, so that he knew he would be one of the last two left to get out of dying, essentially. Because they wouldn't have let him out, because I guess at first he had tried to talk them out of anyone killing themselves, and they said all should just surrender and talk with the Romans, but they wanted to kill him because they were calling him a traitor. I don't know if this is all contained within his writings, but it was in the dramatization.
The passage I was talking about is in Book 20 of Antiquities of the Jews. And I think the other one is in Book 18.
Yeah, concerning Albinus, under whose procuratorship James was slain, as also what edifices were built by Agrippa. That's the name of the chapter. Oh, no, wait, yeah, chapter 9, yeah. Let me find... I love Wikisource. All his stuff's on here. Really nicely formatted, too. This is the other thing that I think where mythicism kind of does a little bit of apologetics, like with the James and the brother of Jesus thing. Yeah, he could have been talking about a different Jesus and a different James, but I mean, I don't know. It's kind of asking a lot to just discount that without any... I mean, you're saying, yeah, maybe he's not. Well, yeah, maybe he's not. But then again, maybe he is.
Yeah,
But was there ever a high priest of the temple named Jesus?
probably was, yeah.
So Joshua, so Yeshua or whatever, would that be?
Yeah, Jesus is a Latinized version of the same name, yeah.
When was he high priest, Reuben?
I think the 60s, early 60s, I think. But ask Ruben what he thinks.
Now that would be convincing if that's true. If he was around the time of the Jewish War.
Okay, so Ruben's talking about a different time then. Okay.
Oh yeah, this is way long ago. So how could Josephus be talking about him?
But I mean, Josephus's context in chapter 20 there is events of the early 7th century, in the 60s, early 60s. I mean, 7th decade, I mean, not century.
Well, then why do apologists quote it as a mention of Jesus of Galilee?
That's always bewildered me. That exact question has always bewildered me. They're looking for references to Jesus anywhere they can find them.
But here it says, like, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. Okay, so are you saying that...
Read the larger context, and he's talking about events in the 60s.
But he's talking about, yeah. So how could he be mentioning someone in 500 BC? Oh, okay. I just saw that, Reuben. Sorry. Jesus, son of Damnius. Okay.
Anyway, I think this is not about the same Jesus as the New Testament, and I think that who is called Christ is a later interpolation. But just talking about passages that put Jesus outside the normal time period the gospel placed him in, this has to be considered as an example.
Yeah, this is weird. I mean, if Josephus is saying he's a high priest, that is kind of odd. Do apologists just ignore that part and say, "Oh, it says Jesus, and it says James, therefore it's Jesus of Galilee"?
I've never read enough apologists' arguments to know how they take that, but the question does bewilder me.
I'll have to read more about this too. Well, I'll just read this whole chapter actually after we're done.
Yeah, I think we're still alive.
Yeah, when I don't see it here in the wiki page, but when did Jesus, son of Damnius, says that he was made high priest? High priest. What's the date of that event? Does he say? Or roughly the dates? Anyone know off the top of their head? Doesn't even say in the wiki article about him. Just says that Josephus mentions him.
I don't know.
Late 60s. Oh, wow. Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, the fact that this happens right before the Jewish War, or at the beginning of the war, yeah.
Namely, right before the temple falls. Yeah,
So
that is really interesting.
there's always a possibility that, going back to what started this whole conversation, that if there is a historical Jesus that was like a zealot figure or something, he may have originally existed and worked, did his stuff in the 60s, but the Gospels just later on, when they fictionalize the stories, they backdate it. Yeah.
Now, why would they do that? I mean, it's odd. And what's more odd is if the real Jesus was based off of this guy, no one hearing the Gospels afterward, familiar with any of this history, could possibly think it was the same guy because, Jesus being a high priest, that's just crazy. Jesus was bashing the temple institution and calling everyone they're hypocrites, or the Sadducees and Pharisees, especially the Pharisees.
Hebrews calls Jesus high priest. The book of Hebrews.
But does it literally mean he was high priest of the temple?
No. It calls him a replacement high priest. After the temple is destroyed, basically, it's destroyed basically so he could do his work as high priest from heaven. Without conflicting, I guess, with what the earthly priests are doing.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Do any authors you guys know of, have they tried to argue that Jesus of the Gospels is at least partly based off of Jesus, son of Damnius?
I haven't heard that specifically, but yet, there's the argument that Mark is based on events of the Jewish War. And that's where I'm kind of coming from, even though I can't argue that effectively.
Well, Dr. Price has argued that he thinks Mark, or at least a part of Mark, was actually based off of the war with Simon Bar Kokhba, or Bar Kosiba, or however you say it.
That's
Because
also.
he's saying it sounds more like that event than the 70.
I haven't seen them laid out in the comparison to really judge that myself, but I've heard both ideas.
Yeah. Reuben, do you happen to know of anyone that's made that connection, or has it been made to your knowledge that the Jesus of the Gospels was at least in part based off of or influenced by this Jesus, son of Damnius? Have you heard anything about that? Interesting. But apologists do use this as a mention of Jesus of Galilee. Am I correct in saying that? I mean, they don't just, yes, why on earth do they do that? Are they saying that Josephus just is getting mixed up?
Beats me.
Hmm.
I mean, they also take passages that only refer to the existence of Christians as evidence for the existence of Christ.
Yeah, I know. That's crazy.
Also.
Yeah. Oh wait, you mean ancient authors knew that there were Christians around, and that proves Jesus existed? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we already knew that there were people around at that time believing in Jesus.
Yeah.
That's not the question.
Exactly, but apologists still use that.
What do you mean, David? What do you think Jesus of Nazareth might have been a reaction of Jesus, son of Damnius? Reaction against? You mean like he was a rhetorical creation to kind of have a polemic against Jesus, son of Damnius? Is that what you mean?
The issue I have with that is there's already evidence, like from Philo, which Richard Carrier points out, that there's already connection in the name Joshua with the Messianic figure.
This book looks really interesting, Reuben. Have you read this book? Reuben posted a link to a book called Three Messiahs, the Historical Judas the Galilean, the Revolutionary Christ Jesus, and the Mythical Jesus of Nazareth.
I haven't read it. Though it's $3 on Kindle, though, maybe we will.
Reuben says, I've argued that the guy has the name Joshua/Jesus on account of his status as the prophet like Moses, the successor of Moses, the lawgiver. The guy equals Jesus.
Plus, there's a passage in Zechariah that is what Philo bases it on.
Wait, so repeat that?
There's also a passage in the prophet Zechariah that mentions the name Joshua. And Philo takes that as kind of a messianic figure.
Oh, really? Huh. Well, there's a lot of stuff in John's Gospel. Well, not a lot, but the whole Logos idea seems to be taken right out of Philo.
Yeah.
Man, I just have so much to learn in this field. There's like so many angles to approach all this stuff. It's just overwhelming.
I haven't read Philo myself. That's also on my to-do list, but I got so many conflicting things on my to-do list I can't do them all at once. I haven't read Josephus all the way through either. Actually, I bought it years ago. I loaned the copy to my dad, and he's read it, but I've never read it.
Reuben, what's the origin of this term, prophet like Moses? Is this someone that Philo wrote about?
I think it's in Deuteronomy.
In the Torah, okay.
Yes, in Deuteronomy.
This is a character from Deuteronomy.
Near the end of Deuteronomy, you might be able to find it pretty quick.
Yeah, he posted it. Deuteronomy 18:15 to 19.
Reading from Friedman's translation, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet from among you, from your brothers, like me. You shall listen to him in accordance with everything that you asked from the Lord your God at Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not continue to hear the voice of the Lord my God, and let me not see this big fire anymore, so I won't die. And the Lord said to me, they've been good in what they've spoken. I'll raise up a prophet for them from among their brothers, like you. I'll put my words in his mouth, and he'll speak to them everything that I'll command him. And it will be the man who won't listen to my words that he'll speak in my name. I shall require it from him. Just the prophet who will presume to speak a thing in my name that I didn't command him to speak, and who will speak in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And if you'll say in your heart, how shall we know the thing that the Lord didn't speak it? Then the prophet will speak in the Lord's name, and the thing won't be and won't come to pass. And that is the thing that Yahweh did not say. The prophet spoke it presumptuously. You shall not be fearful of him.
Reuven's saying that Jews and Christians agree that it's a dual prophecy, and that Christians think it was Jesus, and Jews think it was either Ezra or Samuel, possibly Elijah. Christians might have thought that too, since the two messengers are Moses and Elijah. And isn't there a lot of similarities between Elijah's work and the stories about Jesus, like the multiplying of the food, right? Doesn't
Definitely.
Elijah actually multiply loaves and fishes, or is it just something else? Huh. So Reuven, are you saying when you said that you've argued that the guy has the name Joshua or Jesus, are you saying that Jesus of Galilee was based off of this passage from, he's named that because of this passage in Deuteronomy? Ah, interesting. Okay. Possibly by the Ebionites, right? Same thing. Or Matthew's community. Now, do you separate those, Reuben? Do you think that Matthew was an Ebionite? Or separate but related? Separate and related, okay. Now, how does this figure into your view that that it's a Christ myth having to do with Egypt or Alexandria? That this is where this whole story got concocted, kind of? As part of the historicization, when the movement reached Judea and Syria, it grabbed various things from the available movements, one of which expected the prophet like Moses, hence Jesus / Joshua. So do you have a theory or hypothesis on like the actual seed, like the bare seed of this myth? Once you get rid of all the stuff that you think was added on as it went from Judea, or was it went out of Egypt and reached Judea and Syria? Like what was the core, do you think? What were the core aspects of what was created in Egypt or envisioned in Egypt? just a dying and rising God type of thing, or what? Hmm. Oh, okay, so you pick up on that stuff. Okay. He
And
says,
don't,
before the foundation of the world by the archons, powers of heaven, principalities and powers, as Paul says.
and also just tracing, older Jewish use of the word Joshua. And don't forget, there's a book in the Old Testament Apocrypha in the Septuagint, nowadays known as Ecclesiasticus, but also known as the Wisdom of the Son of Syriac. But it's supposed to be written by Joshua ben Syriac. Joshua the son of Syriac. So basically, Jesus, wrote one of the books of the Old Testament.
Hmm. Reuven, how much of what you've been saying just then is this similar to what is this similar to what Doherty's arguing in his book? Is this kind of pretty much what his view is, or similar to it? Okay, not sure. Okay, so you kind of have your own synthesis of all this stuff out there. You should write your own book, Reuven. In 20 years.
20 years is too late, though. Christ's going to return before
I
that.
don't want to wait that long. Well, all the Bible geeks would buy your book. Yeah. Yeah, you'd be rich. I wish Doherty's book wasn't so darn expensive in print. $75.
I don't remember it being that expensive, and I got my copy. I think I got mine for like 40, I think. But it's a lot of pages to it, though, so it's a...
814.
Yeah.
Sorry, I missed the thing you were saying that Reuven said Achari likes to say, Jesus ben Sirach. Could you say that again? Sorry.
Well, I was just saying there's an apocryphal Old Testament book that's attributed to a Jesus, to a Jesus, the son of Syriac.
What's the dating of it, of the writing of it?
Reuben is saying about 170 BC.
Okay, and he quotes it?
I'm not aware of the New Testament Jesus quoting that book. I don't know what Reuben meant. Oh, you're saying it's the words of Syriac, and Joshua is just recording them.
No, I think he's saying Jesus from the Gospels quotes Sirach.
Oh, okay, he did say, okay. I don't remember that.
Yeah, that's a Christ myth theory book. Like, that's David. That book, Jesus Neither God Nor Man by Doherty, is the book Dr. Price seems to say is like pretty much the premier Christ myth book out there. He says that's pretty much the one to get.
Yeah, Yeah, it was V1 prior to Carrier's book coming out, and now Carrier didn't replace Doherty's book; they supplement each other. So yeah, those
You
two
want to
are
read them both, yeah.
the pillars of the Christ-Smith theory, pretty much, in its modern formulation.
There are 4 well-known quotes from Christ that relate to Sirach. Most well-known is Christ's statement in Matthew chapter 7, verse 16 through 20, which draws from Sirach chapter 27, verse 6. Also Matthew 6, verse 12, and forgive us our debts, and we forgive our debtors. Mirrors Sirach 28, verse 2. Forgive your neighbor a wrong, and then, when you petition, your sins will be pardoned. That is very similar. Mark chapter 4, verse 5, 6, and 16 through 17 also resembles Sirach 40. I'm going to have to look these up. I'm actually going to copy this text here.
Yeah, I usually copy the text to a file before I leave the chat at the end of each Hangout.
That's not a bad idea. Moreover, patristic scholar Henry Chadwick claimed that in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, Jesus directly quoted Sirach 51:27. There are a number of references to the book of Sirach in the New Testament. James chapter 1, verse 19 seems to quote Sirach chapter 5, verse 11. The Blessed Virgin Mary alludes to Sirach, verse 10, chapter 14, in Luke chapter 1, verse 52. That must be from this. Is that from her song? I wonder. Luke 1:52 is, he has brought down rulers from their thrones and has exalted those who are humble. Sirach 10:14. Wow, that's on Bible Gateway too. The Lord has overthrown kings and put humbler people in their place. That is very similar, yeah. Wow.
But anyway, my point in bringing it up is nothing in particular except to say that assigning of wise sayings to Jesus or to Joshua predates the Christian era, basically.
Yeah. So Reuben, yeah, he has brought down rulers from their thrones and exalted. Yeah. We know for certain the Christians were reading Sirach. Man, I wish you had a mic, Reuben.
But it just goes to the point that Joshua was actually not that uncommon of a name. So.
Right. But in connection with James and someone being called Christ, like in Josephus, it's very odd. But then again, because
the who is called Christ line there is probably an interpretation.
Added, yeah.
The text that was originally in Josephus, but those words there are probably added.
Yeah, because it seems like everything else there in Josephus isn't even relating to the Jesus we know.
Exactly, that's my problem.
So,
yep.
So apologists must say, well, it does mention our Jesus, just that Josephus was confused about who he was exactly or what he did. I'm sure they say something like that. That's what I would say if I was
maybe we should find what the apologists would actually read what they write instead of actually assuming.
Yeah, probably. I'm just making guesses. That's what I'd say if I was an apologist. Ephesians borrows the whole armor of God from Wisdom of Solomon. One scribe makes a Jesus for the Jesus. One scribe mistakes a Jesus for the Jesus, and we have lengthy discussions and debate over it. Thanks, scribe.
How do you bold the text in the chat?
I think you just put asterisks on each side of it.
That's nice. This Hangout supported that.
What are you referring to there, Reuben? The thing from scribe mistakes. Oh, okay, gotcha. You're referring to the Josephus thing. Who was the Christ? From Josephus chapter book 20, chapter 9. Okay. Is that right? Yeah, okay. If he only knew all the reams of paper he would end up wasting by that little addition. Okay, I guess live's going away, so thanks everybody for coming in. See you next week.